Hey guys, I'm here to talk about oil painting materials today. These are the materials that I use and recommend to all my students. So I'd like to go over paints, palettes, brushes, panels and canvases to paint on, mediums, and other miscellaneous items. So to start, we'll talk about paints. These are Winsor & Newton Artist Oil Colors, and I recommend these because this is what I learned on when I studied at the Angel Academy of Art. I recommend them because you can find them in both Italy and in the United States. You can find them even if you're in the middle of nowhere. They're probably at your local art store. They're good quality, so you can feel confident about that, and yet they won't break the bank like some other paints. So I really recommend these paints. Another thing that I recommend to students is that you want to stick to a very similar painting palette as you're learning. I've been using this same palette since 2007, 2008, so it's been 10 years basically that I've used basically the same colors. And what's good about that is that you can really get to know your colors really well. You can know what to expect. If you're mixing raw umber with yellow ochre plus a little bit of white, you know exactly what it's going to look like. And that makes painting much easier when you can cut out variables and just streamline it and have more knowledge than not. So I do recommend sticking with the same brand or palette pretty much across the board. These are in order that I lay them out on the palette. And so this one's titanium white, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, burnt umber, raw umber, ivory black, French ultramarine blue, Alizarine Crimson, and Cadmium Red. Sometimes I'll vary these slightly, so maybe I'll have like a Cadmium Red light instead, or I'll have maybe a Cadmium Yellow light as well. But basically, this is the palette that I use. And what's nice about it is that it's really versatile. You can take it outside and use it to paint plein air, or you could use it to paint still lifes and figures. So I use this palette to paint everything. Occasionally I'll add in, let's say, a manganese blue, because I have a blue here. The ultramarine blue leans a little bit towards red, whereas if you add in something like a manganese, it leans towards green, and so you end up having that balance. Between the two reds here, you have a red that leans towards violet, and you have a red that leans towards orange, so you have both sides of the red. And so sometimes I'll also, especially if I'm plein air painting and I need a really bright yellow that isn't quite this yellow, I'll add in a yellow that leans towards green, because this cadmium yellow leans a little bit towards orange. So, but basically this palette has already 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues, assuming that your ivory black is a blue, which it is. Mars black tends to lean a little bit more towards reddish black, but the ivory black leans towards blue, so it's a really nice color to have on your palette. Other times I will reduce this palette down to 4 colors. So I'll choose one of the 2 reds, I'll use the ivory black as a blue, the yellow ochre, and the titanium white, and those 4 colors cover both your red, your blue, your yellow, and your white. So you have pretty much everything you need, as well as your black serving as your blue and your darkest dark. So it's really nice. Yeah, so one thing that you want to look out for, and the reason why I said stick to a brand, you don't have to stick to all Winsor & Newton or all Rembrandt oil colors. But one thing to keep an eye out is for colors that have the same name but look completely different. So for example, raw umber in Winsor & Newton leans a little bit towards green, whereas in other brands it might lean towards purple. And so it can be really distracting when you're using your raw umber for a certain, to have a certain hue, and you get a different brand and it has a different hue. It can be really confusing. So that's one thing that I say to students is just be aware of your colors, and this palette is really everything that you need. It has your high chroma colors being your cadmiums, it has your lower chroma colors being your earth colors, and it ranges from really light to really dark, so it really does cover all your bases. In another lecture, I'll talk about the 3 parts of color, being hue, value, and chroma, and how to distinguish those. So I do apologize if you're confused by my terminology when I talk about color, and chroma being one of them, and hue. But it's just a part of color. So we'll talk about that later. But one thing you'll notice too is that these colors are laid out on a palette. This is a paper palette. It's a gray paper palette by New Wave. And I really like using this lately, especially if I'm not standing and holding my palette, but maybe I'm sitting and painting flowers or some smaller objects. I will use this palette because at the end of the day I can throw it away. I can just rip that page off, crumple it up and throw it away and not have to worry about cleaning my palette. Other times what I'll do is mix a whole bunch of colors and want to save what I've done. Not to use it again because the paint will dry, but to save it as an example of what I used on a certain painting. So for example, maybe I painted a portrait and I'm halfway through, or I just started, and I mixed all the perfect colors for the cheeks, the lips, the eyes, things like that. What you can do is have them, once they're all mixed on here, save that, let it dry and save it, and you'll always have it. And it's really cool because I have a whole bunch of these saved from different projects. I have one from my latest portrait painting of the woman wearing the purple kimono, and one from the multiple figure triptych painting that I did. And you can compare them side by side and see interesting differences and similarities, and use that palette again if, let's say, you wanted to paint a portrait that matched those same colors. So it's really cool. Other palettes I have here for you is I have the teeny tiny palette that I learned on. I can't even believe that I learned on this, it's so small, but it worked. It's a wooden handheld palette and really lightweight. I think that's important. I also have here my palette, my handheld palette that I often use now. It is huge and it looks heavy, but it's really not heavy. I can hold this for hours at a time and not have it be an issue at all. It's a turtlewood palette. If you go to turtlewoodpalettes.com, you can order those. It's the palette that I recommend, this and the New Wave palettes, because they are large enough working surfaces so that you can mix as many colors as you need without having to scrape down or start over, but also lightweight and counterbalance so that you don't end up having arthritis in your thumb from holding your palette for too many years and having it be stressing on your thumb. So those are the palettes that I like to use. But like I said, recently I've been using the disposable ones because they're really nice. So there's that. This is my recommended palette knife. I'm really specific about tools because I found some that work way better than others. So like for example, this tool. There are a bunch of different palette knives out there, but I really like this one because it has a gooseneck. You can see that it goes up instead of being flat across, and it's round. That really helps because I mix a lot of my colors with the palette knife instead of using my brushes to mix. I pre-mix so that my palette is laid out for efficient working order. And the elevation of this gooseneck helps so that your fingers don't get covered in paint. What's also nice about this is that it's not too big and it's not too small. So when I'm mixing a bunch of puddles, if I had a really big palette knife, it would make really big puddles and it would make this palette seem small. If I had a really tiny palette knife, the palette knife would probably become overwhelmed with the amount of paint that I would want to use for the amount of paint that I would want to mix. So this is a happy medium. It's probably 1.5 inches tall. It's also metal. It lasts a lot longer than plastic. It's made in Italy. You can find them at a lot of your art stores. And it also has sharper corners rather than rounded ones. And that is nice for if you want to scrape dry paint off of your palette, or if you have to scrape a little bit of dry paint off of your canvas. So yeah, this is the palette knife that I use and recommend. What else? We have medium cups. These are the medium cups that I've used for years. They're really dirty and gross, but I love them because they can clip onto your palette. So they clip right on, and so if you're holding your palette or whatever, it's fine, you have your mediums right there. What's nice too is the depth of these cups. So they, like oftentimes I'll be holding my palette and not even realize that I'm holding it at an angle like this. So if the medium cups were really short, the medium would fall all over my front side, but it doesn't because these are really deep. So that's why I recommend them. You don't even have to think about worrying about getting medium on you with those depths. So those are really good. I like those a lot. I also have this brush holder. This is a really basic brush holder that is not expensive. What's great about it is it folds into, it folds down. I mean, you take out these three pillars and you can take it outside and set it up and paint plein air with it. Or, you know, it's really lightweight and it's just a great brush holder. Also because it has different slots in here. So oftentimes I'll have a handful of brushes and some will be light, some will be medium, some will be dark brushes. And if I'm setting my brushes down and want to stay really organized, I can put my light brushes, my medium brushes, and my dark brushes in sort of order. And that really helps. So what I like about this is it's systematic enough without being too restrictive. Between mixing your paint, having paint on your palette, and having your brushes have paint on them, I think that these tools really do work for good streamlining without being too tight and too specific about how to do something. Like, so for example, what I mean by that is sometimes people will label their brushes. This is a medium brush, this is a light brush, this is a dark brush. And I think sometimes that can slow you down a lot. So this is a nice way to stay streamlined and still be a proficient, quick painter. So other important things are mediums. So I have Gamblin's Gamsol. What's nice about that is it's 100% odorless mineral spirits. And so it can be used with your painting and in your painting. And it can also be used to clean your brushes. So it's really good quality. That's a really good company. What's also nice about that is you can't smell it as much. So the other like turpentine and things, turpenoid and things like that at the stores, even if they say odorless, you tend to smell them a lot, and that can be a huge irritant. And that's not to say that this doesn't permeate the air, because it does, it just doesn't smell as much. So make sure you have good ventilation in your studio. This is refined linseed oil. It's from Winsor & Newton. I've used this for years from the Angel Academy as well. And what I recommend, I really like the refined version. And what I don't recommend is using sun-bleached linseed oil. A friend and I had an experience in school with sun-bleached linseed oil. He was working right next to me, and he had been working on this cast painting for weeks, if not months. And we left for holiday break. And we come back, and this cast painting is, if you've never heard of it, it's basically painting a white cast of a sculpture. So it's mostly light value, very much white painting. And we come back from the 3-week holiday, and he has all these yellow spots on his painting that weren't there before. And what it was the sun-bleached linseed oil had unbleached itself on his canvas because it hadn't been out in the sun. So it was a solvable problem. He just brought his painting out into the sun and bleached it for a couple hours, and the yellow spots went away. But that's not something that you want to have to do all the time, and it can be kind of a scary experience, and obviously you wouldn't want your clients to have to do that either. So the refined linseed oil is already yellow. Oils are an important aspect of using oil paint, and they do yellow, but this one will yellow a lot less than that one, and it won't yellow in front of your eyes like that. That being said, I don't use much medium at all when I'm painting, and I'll talk about that in another video about technique. So those are the mediums. This is the panel that I like to use. It's a Raphael oil primed linen panel, and you can search online. I think that they're found at jerry'sautorama.com, but they're made in Italy, and they're really nice because they're really smooth linen, and you can see it's not that wide of a panel, but it's wide enough so it doesn't warp them. It doesn't warp. I think if it was a really big panel, it would warp, but this is only an 8 by 10, and I use these probably up to like a 16 by 20 size. So what I love about this is that, first of all, it's linen, and second, it's really smooth linen. So when I'm painting, I really like the subject or the object to look as real as possible. And if you have a textured linen, the texture can detract from that 3D representation on that 2D surface. So having a smooth portrait linen to work on, even if you're just doing still life, is really nice because the viewer won't get caught up in the texture of the canvas. Or if you're painting a portrait, for example, maybe by accident you lined it up so that there's a big textured dot of the linen right next to the eye, and it's just really distracting. So this linen is really smooth. It lets the paint sit on there really nicely, and I really like it because I do paint relatively thinly, so it helps to create the illusion of form on a 2D surface. So there's that. There's paper towels, obviously, you use those a lot, and brushes. So I have a lot of brushes here. What my go-to brush is the Ebony Mark Creative Splendor brush. This is a filbert, and it's a size 10. So I really like these brushes because they are soft and they're relatively inexpensive. So you can pay a lot of money. You can pay a lot for brushes, and oftentimes you'll pay a lot for brushes that have real hair rather than synthetic hair. I think there are benefits to having both, but what I really like about these is that they're really soft. They don't have too much of a spring, but they have enough spring, and they lay down a nice smooth stroke. And so when I'm painting, I don't like to have the brushstrokes stand out as the primary thing. I like the object to stand out and the brushstrokes to be second. So these brushes really help with that, with creating a nice soft brushstroke, something that isn't necessarily visible unless you want it to be. The other thing about brushes is that they have different cuts across the top. So this is a filbert. You can see it's rounded on the top. Filberts are also my go-to because when you're using them and you're putting down a stroke, it won't show the beginning of the stroke. Whereas if you use the kind of brush that's flat across, like this, or angled, like this one, the beginning of the stroke will show. And sometimes you want that, but oftentimes I don't want that. So that's why I like to use the filberts. You can also use filberts to make nice straight lines. So I'll often use these instead of a liner brush sometimes as well. You can see I have a whole bunch of different sizes, of different brands. A lot of these are cheap ones that you can buy at most art stores. I just look for that soft hair. Some of them are real hair brushes, like this one. This is a rosemary brush. It is a long, flat Series 279. So it has real hair. It's really soft. I like to use this brush if I want to knock down any ridges, or if I have any brush strokes that I want to smooth out and make them look not like brush strokes. I'll use that to, that softness, like a feather, to knock down those ridges. Or I'll use it with a lot of paint and actually use the fact that it's big and wide and not super soft to create a look of a brush stroke. So there's options, and you want to have a variety of brushes. And so, look for all those different things. What was confusing for me when I went to university, I studied studio art. They always told us to buy bristle brushes, and bristle brushes are not good for creating nice smooth strokes. They're good for scrubbing in if you want to put in your underlayer and you don't want to ruin your nice soft haired brushes. You can use the bristle brush and it's really good for that. It can take more abuse. But what I don't like about bristle brushes for the upper layers is when you're trying to create a nice stroke, oftentimes the bristles will pull paint up rather than lay it down nice and smoothly. So bristle brushes are more about the brush stroke than anything else. So I tend to stay away from these just because of the type of painting that I do and the type of brush strokes that I do. But I do have a couple, like I said, for the beginning parts of paintings and things like that. So I think that's about it. I hope that was informative. This video is mostly to show what my video tutorials will be like. Sometimes I'll talk about materials like this, and other times I'll talk about technique. So